Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint black curly fur in acrylics. Now the first thing that I want to work on here is getting a good base foundation in place. Now this was a smaller 3x5 inch study, but I would be normally working in smaller chunks rather than one individual layer. But even at this stage you can see that I'm working in small sections, but I will be doing the entire base layer first. But if I was working on a pet portrait, I would only do the base layer of one area and then work on the next and then just gradually piece that portrait together. Now that's my personal preference, I just prefer working with smaller chunks, but if you do want to work in individual layers like I am here, you do want to make sure that each layer is given the right amount of time. I do find that working on individual layers for entire portraits, when you're working on all of the face at one time, we can rush through certain layers, so we want to be very aware of that. Now this first base layer stage, I want to be working with getting that paint blended. You can see this looks pretty terrible, but it's meant to at this stage, but the most important thing here is I don't have any harsh edges. So for this first layer, what I'm doing to create this blended look is using a wet on wet blending technique. So when I apply my lighter or darker paint, I'm then coming back in with a different value, light or dark, and then mixing that in with my wet paint that I've just applied. Now by doing that, I'm able to then blend the two sections of wet paint together and get that naturally soft edge. Now by doing this doesn't look great, as I've said, it's meant to look like this at this stage. We don't want to be focusing on the details at any point during our base foundation process. Now at this second layer, this is where I can really start to reinforce more of the depth. Now the one thing that you'll also notice here is that I'm following the fur direction. This is something that I talk about in all tutorials. I've got a video here on YouTube. It's my top tips for painting realistic fur. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. But this is something that I cover thoroughly in all of my real-time tutorials on Patreon. The fur direction is what's going to help to build up that three-dimensional look of that animal. Now even though this is a study, I still want to be making sure that the general fur direction here is accurate. Now the wonderful thing about painting curly fur is it's very forgiving. I personally don't want to be focusing on getting every single curl in exactly the right place. I don't think that's important, but I do want to make sure that they are travelling in the right direction, that they're curving correctly, and that I've got about the right number of curls. But again, I'm not counting the curls, it's just going for close. So for this second layer, I'm using a different blending technique. This here is a fine mist spray bottle, and I'm going to be using this to apply a layer of water over my surface. And then I'm going to be using the round brush to apply my paint, and then I'm going to use a blending brush to push that into the layer of water that I've sprayed first. Now you can see this gives you a very soft look. However, using a fine mist spray bottle takes quite a bit of practice. Now when I first tried using them, it was very frustrating. You'd end up putting far too much water on the surface and then the paint would just run down your canvas. So there is a bit of trial and error with using this tool, without a doubt, but once you're confident with that, it can be a real game changer. Now this is something that I focus thoroughly in the real-time version of this first study on Patreon. So if you'd like to see how to use that fine mist spray bottle to make your acrylics look more like oils, it's a very worthwhile, very valuable tool to use, then I'll link my Patreon in the description below. Now one thing that is a bit hard to judge when you're watching footage that's been sped up is it makes it appear that I'm using more water more frequently, when in actual fact I'm using my hairdryer at many times throughout this layering process to make sure that I'm drying it at the right stage as well as adding the water. There is a real balance here. You don't want to keep on adding too much water because you're going to lift the paint underneath. Even if that paint feels a little bit tacky and you add more water on top, that's enough to lift that paint up. So at times throughout the real-time tutorial on Patreon, I'm focusing on the drying time as much as the water and painting time. Now as you can see here, this is all about a layering process. Regardless of the fur or the animal that I'm painting, the layering and the way that I'm applying my paint takes a huge amount of the painting process. It's something that I like to really focus on because without the layers, we don't have any way of building up the depth. Now the one thing at this stage is with the layers that I'm applying, I'm now going in and darkening up my shadows. Now this here is where I'm reinforcing my contrast. This again is something that I focus on all of my tutorials, both here on YouTube and on Patreon. If I don't have good contrast, or my values aren't right, so my shadows aren't dark or my highlights aren't bright enough, the painting's going to appear quite flat. Now my highlights are something that I'm going to be building up as I go, but I do want to be making sure that I've got my base foundation and the areas in between the curls nice and dark. So that's why throughout this painting, at this stage moving forward, I'll be going in and reinforcing my dark values. But as I'm building up my layers here, my paint is gradually getting lighter with each additional layer that I add. Now again, even at this stage, I'm not adding any real fine detail. This is just the main groups of highlights within the curls that I've been working on. As I come in now through this current layer, I'm now going to be breaking up this into more tiny, tighter curls. So it's all about focusing on each individual layer and trying not to rush through this process too quickly. When painting curly fur, it's very easy to think, oh, well, there's lots of fur, there's lots of curls here, I'm just going to put a load of random brush strokes. But before we know it, we've actually covered up too much or too many of the darker layers underneath, and then your painting can end up looking quite flat and all one tone. So you want to be paying very close attention to not getting too carried away and adding brush strokes for the sake of it. And again, this is just a rinse and repeat process here, but the one thing now that you'll notice is I'm not using the fine mist spray bottle as much. So there isn't as often as that fine layer over the top of my painting, because I don't need to have as much softness within these brush strokes as I did previously. Now the one thing with this fur texture is because the curly fur, it sits on top of a very soft looking fur texture, the use of the fine mist spray bottle has been invaluable throughout this stage right up to this point in the painting process. If I hadn't have got my base layers all nice and soft like that, then the curls on top that we start to put in with the details are going to look quite rigid and harsh. So the fur texture, although it may look curly, it would potentially have a bit more of a wiry, coarser look to it. So the fine mist sprayer bottle and all of the layers underneath the details for curly fur, I feel are very, very important. Now something that I have briefly mentioned and that I spoke about so many times throughout the real-time version on Patreon is not focusing on getting every single curl spot on. I want to go for close, but even at this stage here, it's so easy to go, oh, do you know what, there should be one curl there, half a centimetre to the left or the right, and then we start getting really sort of quite hard on ourselves that it's not exactly spot on. Now if you're going for a hyper realistic painting where you want your painting and your reference photos side by side and you physically can't tell the difference between the two, then yes, you do want to be making sure that every single curl is exactly precise and spot on. But if you're going for photorealism like how I like to achieve in my work, then I want to just go for close. So as I've said, you want to make sure that you're curving your brush strokes in the right way to follow the shape of the curls. You want to have roughly about the right amount of curls and that you don't have that rigid look. You still want to be getting the texture of that fur right. So all of these things, the brush technique, the layering, the contrast, all of these things, so the glazes to soften out curls, which we're going to get to in a moment, all of these things are going to really help, regardless if you're going for a photorealistic finish or a hyper-realistic finish. But as I've said, with a hyper-realistic painting, you do want to be making sure that everything is exact to that reference photo. Now, if you are using hyperrealism, I think a grid method would work quite well so that you can have your grid and you can know exactly where each curl should be in relation to your reference photo. Now at this stage here, you'll notice that I have switched over to using a liner or a rigger brush. Now this is enabling me to get my longer but finer lines. Now using a liner or a rigger brush requires a different consistency of paint versus water in order to get this brush to work effectively. So this is something that I do cover in pretty much all of my tutorials on Patreon where I'm using a liner brush for fur. Now when you've got a fur texture that does need to have a bit more of a longer brush stroke, it's harder at times to use your filberts for that because they can only hold so much paint. Whereas a liner or a rigger brush, because the bristles are that much longer, they enable that paint to be able to be flowed for more of a continuous, consistent movement. But you do have to make sure that you've got the balance of water and paint, the consistency of that mixture right. If you don't have the paint thin enough, then it's not going to be able to create the length of those brush strokes that you want. You can also get some start and stop points in that brush stroke as well. Now if you do find that that's happening, just add a little bit more water to that mixture and that should fix that problem. You'll be able to get a nice continuous movement with that brush stroke. Now if you add too much water and you create that brush stroke and it looks a bit transparent, and it's almost like when you lift that brush off after the brush stroke's been done and you have a little bit of like a bubble or a bead up at the end of that brush stroke, then that's an indication that you've got a bit too much water in that mixture. Now, of course, if that brush stroke, the one that you've created, it runs down your surface, then that is far, far too much water. So then you want to add more paint to thicken that back up. But a liner brush is one of those brushes where it does take a little bit of practice. So what I would recommend to do is just take a scrap bit of watercolour paper and just some standard black paint and get used to mixing water with that one colour and creating the brush stroke that you want. And then when you've done the preparation, the practice with that brush, you're not going to be as stressed and frustrated when using it on your project. And I do find that sometimes, even now, I've used a liner or a rigger brush many times, and you don't get the consistency right first time. It does take a little bit of trial and error, but once you've got that right, it's very much of, oh no, I need more water, or actually that's now too thin, I just need to add a little bit more paint. But if you've got any questions relating to anything there, anything art related or using one of these brushes, then feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. Now the techniques that I've shared here in the layering process, this would be exactly the same regardless of the fur colour that I would be painting. So even if it was a curly coated brown poodle, tan, anything, I would be using the same layering process, the same blending techniques with your fine mist spray bottle, and always saving those liner or rigger brushes for these last layers. Now in a moment, once I finished using this smaller liner brush, I'm going to then come back in with a filbert brush, and this is where I'm now going to be working with glazes. Glazes for me is a really important part of any of my paintings, regardless of what it is that I've got on the easel. Now I do have a dedicated video that I've created all about glazes, and I've got a few paintings there where I'm demonstrating how I use glazes for different scenarios. So if that's of interest, I'll pop the link to that glazing video in the description below. But basically what I'm doing here is I'm creating a thinner mixture and applying it in specific areas where I want to either darken that curl, which is what I'm doing here for the glaze, or glazes can be used to adjust the colour of the fur. Now again, that video would be really worthwhile if you are interested in what glazes can potentially do, because for acrylics I think they make a massive difference. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you'd like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to see the entire real-time tutorial, then it is available on my Patreon now. You get the reference photo, line art and full material list. And as I've mentioned, I've got the voiceover while I'm painting, so it's all in the moment. I'm explaining every process thoroughly. If you do have any questions, any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm going to be uploading another video here to YouTube in the next few days. And as always, thank you so much for watching.